Tonight, imagine the hush of a medieval hall lit only by a scatter of tallow candles, their flames bending and straightening as the draught sighs through the cracks of the timber walls. The smoke clings to your hair, sharp and greasy, while outside the dark press of night presses down like an extra roof. A dog growls faintly in the courtyard, then falls back into silence. You stand here on the edge of a marriage feast, the long tables creaking under trenchers of bread, pots of thin ale, and salted pork. The air smells of sweat and stew, of wool cloaks damp with mist, and of wax dripping from the rushlight. Everyone speaks too loudly, laughing as if they believe that laughter can hide discomfort. You'd probably never make it through a single medieval night, but don't worry, I'll guide you safely through. So, before we go any further, if this quiet company helps, you can gently tap, like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Maybe lying awake in New York, or drifting in a quiet room in London. Drop your time and place below, so none of us feel alone tonight. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey, together, here on Timeless. The truth of marriage in these centuries is that it rarely resembled the stories painted in chapel glass or sung by troubadours in courts. For most, it was not a union of hearts, but a contract of land, dowry and labor. When you imagine vows whispered before an altar, you must also imagine the unseen hands tallying acres of pasture and counting cows. A bride might glance at her new husband across the smoke-filled air and find not affection but a stranger chosen by fathers who considered soil more sacred than affection. The soft-spoken priest might bless the bond in the name of heaven, but underfoot, the weight of earth dictated everything. As you look around the hall, the newlywed bride sits stiff, her face pale against the crimson wool of her dress. The embroidery along her sleeves, perhaps stitched by her own fingers in long months of preparation, does not comfort her tonight. Her eyes never meet her husband's, they dart instead to her mother's anxious hands twisting in her lap. Somewhere in the crowd, men nudge each other, joking in low voices about her dowry, as if her worth had been poured into the clay cups of ale before them. You notice how her shoulders sink, as if every laugh peels another layer of her spirit away. The groom, meanwhile, boasts loudly of the oxen he now controls, his words slurring with ale, his friends pounding his back. He has married less a woman than a bridge to land he could not reach otherwise. His pride shines like the greasy meat on the table, but it is a pride rooted in possession, not in tenderness. He does not notice his new wife's silence, or if he does, he finds it convenient. After all, a silent bride is easier to manage than one who protests. You see now how scandal does not always arrive with whispers in the dark. Sometimes it is stitched into the marriage itself from the very beginning. The church tried, of course, to guide this chaos. Priests declared that marriages must be entered freely, that consent mattered more than coin. Yet in practice, the echo of that teaching was faint beneath the louder voice of custom. Families exchanged daughters, the way merchants traded sacks of grain, and the priest's words felt like decorative tassels on a garment whose fabric was woven elsewhere. Even when a bride was asked if she consented, the pressure of 50 watching eyes and the looming threat of dishonor left little room for truth. She could nod with trembling lips and still carry within her the seed of silent misery. Sometimes the ceremonies themselves revealed the imbalance. The ring slipped onto her finger did not shine with diamonds. Such extravagance belonged only to rare nobles, but it marked her as transferred, a token less of love than of ownership. At the same time, villagers whispered about marriages made in barns or fields, without any priest at all, vows spoken hurriedly in the heat of passion. The church hated such unions, calling them scandals, but people clung to them as proof that sometimes desire could win, even briefly, over calculation. You walk outside for a breath of cool air and find the stars sharp as nails in the night sky. A group of boys throws bones from a game, laughing until the steward shouts them quiet. Near the stables, a pair of older women whisper about the bride's lineage. They recall rumors of her cousin's disgrace, of how her mother once quarreled over inheritance. Scandal hangs in the air even before the bedding ceremony has begun. You realize that medieval marriage was never only about the two people wed. It was about the endless net of families, neighbors, and rivalries that clung to them like burrs in wool. Step back inside, and the laughter grows rowdy. The bedding is announced, a tradition both bawdy and cruel, where the couple is escorted to their bed by a noisy crowd. Shoes are thrown, songs are sung, ribald jokes tossed like scraps of meat. Imagine the humiliation of lying beneath coarse sheets, while neighbours and kin jeer outside the chamber. Privacy, which you might expect for such a night, simply did not exist. The memory of those sounds would linger longer than the vows spoken before God. If you lean closer to the hearth, you overhear another kind of murmur. Men speak of marriages struck between cousins, allowed because land could not be allowed to scatter into rival hands. They whisper too about priests granting dispensations for unions that bent to rules of kinship. A convenient bending if the families were wealthy enough to persuade. Here is where scandal thrives. In the gap between law and practice, between what is preached and what is paid for, the embers crackle, and you wonder how many of these unions were tinder waiting to spark into feud. The bride's younger brother sits alone on a stool, chewing bread too slowly. He knows that this marriage will strip their family of what little choice remained. His sister is gone now, folded into another household, and he is left to defend the honor of a name already bruised by gossip. You see how marriages carved wounds across generations. A single night's vows might bind cousins together in ways that twisted bloodlines, until priests later declared heirs illegitimate. Families fought lawsuits over who was truly married, who had spoken vows in front of which witness. Misery was not only private, it was woven into the very record books of the age. Sometimes, though, love still flared, and it was treated as scandalous, precisely because it threatened the careful plans of elders. A girl who laughed too warmly at a neighbor's son could throw into question years of calculated betrothal. Such laughter might be punished with confinement, even with whispers of witchcraft if misfortune followed. And yet, in stolen glances and secret meetings by millstreams, ordinary men and women proved that desire did not vanish under the weight of contracts. The tension between these stolen sparks and the heavy chains of expectation is what gave medieval marriages their strange, haunted air. Look again at the hall. The minstrels pluck their lutes, their songs of courtly love sounding almost like jokes in this smoky chamber. They sing of knights pining for unreachable ladies, but everyone here knows that the pining of real brides and grooms will never find such poetic words. Instead, it hides in sighs at the spinning wheel, in long walks carrying water, in letters never sent. If someone ever did sing of such truths, it would sound less like a ballad and more like a lament whispered into the rafters at night. You might be tempted to imagine only nobles suffering these arrangements, but peasants too felt the pinch. A tenant might marry his daughter to the son of another tenant, not for wealth but for survival. Two families sharing a plough could endure, alone they might starve. Yet even there, the bride's smile could sour as she realized that survival was not the same as joy. Scandal might creep in when she lingered too long by the blacksmith's forge, or when he disappeared into the woods with another's wife. Poverty did not erase passion, it only made its consequences harsher. In the hush after the feast, as candles burn low and the hall smells of spilled ale and dying fire, you feel the silence of the bride most of all. It is a silence deeper than exhaustion. It is the silence of a life reducted without her choosing. That silence, multiplied across countless halls and countless years, is why medieval marriages so often dripped with scandal, cousins and misery. For behind the banners and bread loaves, behind the priest's blessing and the ale cups clinking, there was always a quiet truth, that hearts were rarely consulted, and when they were, their answers were often ignored. And so you sit, wrapped in the dim glow of the hearth, realizing that every candle here burns with double light, one for celebration and one for sorrow. Medieval marriage was not only a bond between two people, but a stage where desire, greed, gossip and resignation all played their parts. The wax drips faster now, shadows climb the walls, and you wonder how many of these flames will gutter out into long nights of silent misery, unspoken scandal, and whispered regrets. The air in the hall feels close, but outside in the churchyard, the cold night presses its fingers into every stone. You step away from the warmth of the feast and notice how the graves themselves seem to huddle close, marked with weathered crosses and faint names. Here is where the truth of cousin marriages whispers loudest, the same names repeated again and again, looping like vines tangled around each other. It was no accident. In the medieval world, cousins often found themselves pulled toward the altar, not out of affection, but out of arithmetic. Property, land, and fragile alliances demanded that families look inward rather than outward, stitching themselves tighter with each generation. Imagine yourself a daughter of a minor noble house. You grow up learning to spin flax, to manage servants, to read enough scripture to satisfy a confessor. But when your hair is scarcely pinned beneath a veil, your uncle begins speaking of a cousin, a boy you have shared bread with, argued with over toys, seen sulking by the fire. Suddenly you are told he is to be your husband, not because your hearts leaned toward each other, but because the meadow his father owns borders your father's sheep pasture. The line of inheritance can be kept unbroken this way, and so you are offered as though you were another field boundary being carefully marked. The church thundered often against consanguinity, a word so heavy it felt like iron in the mouth. Priests declared that unions within 7 degrees of kinship were forbidden, 7 degrees so far-reaching that it might exclude nearly every suitable match in a small village, and yet dispensations could be bought. Families wealthy enough to petition Rome often received forgiveness, the Pope's seal smoothing over the tangled roots of a family tree. The poor, of course, had no such luxury. They married their cousins in secret, knowing both scandal and salvation pressed close behind. It was a paradox. The very law meant to prevent scandal bred more of it, like weeds springing stronger after being cut down. At the hearth of a peasant cottage, the story looked different yet ended the same. A girl might be betrothed to her mother's sister's son simply because no dowry needed to be exchanged. A favour of kin, a tightening of belts that hurt a little less when kept in the family. The local priest might shake his head, muttering about canon law, but in villages where bloodlines already overlapped like tangled threads, the choice was not much of a choice at all. Cousins knew each other, shared meals, shared secrets, and eventually shared beds whether sanctioned or not. The scandal was not in the act, but in the whispers that followed. Her children will be weak, some said. God will curse their house, others muttered. And yet, the children were born, and life went on. It is difficult for you, perhaps, lying in your modern bed, to imagine how little autonomy stretched into these decisions. Today, cousin marriage might sound like a scandal reserved for distant lands or gossip columns, but in the medieval world, it was practical, ordinary, even expected. The scandal was not so much that it happened, but that it broke the fragile veneer of holiness the church tried to spread. The tension between canon law and custom was like a crack in the church's stained glass, visible, troubling, but never repaired. You remember the bride from before, stiff in her crimson dress. Imagine now, she marries not a stranger from across the valley, but her own cousin. The awkward familiarity clings to every movement. She knows the way he chews, the way he coughs in the cold mornings. There is no mystery, no spark of discovery, only the resigned folding of family into family, until it is hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. At the feast, jokes run sharper, because everyone knows too much. A neighbour laughs. Ah, so the sheep will be cousins too then? The groom grins uneasily, but his eyes flicker toward the priest, whose smile is thin as parchment. There were, of course, dramatic cases. In noble courts, cousin marriages could ignite wars. One marriage too close to kin might be declared invalid, leaving heirs suddenly branded bastards. Kings and dukes played chess with such unions, sometimes binding cousins to strengthen dynasties, sometimes undoing them with accusations of incest when politics demanded. A queen might find herself dismissed, her children erased in a single decree, because someone traced her husband's bloodline too near her own. To be a royal cousin was to live under a sword of paper, ready to fall with every new argument. Still, ordinary people found humour in it all. If cousins marry, one medieval saying joked, their children will be born with only one eye, but it will be sharper than both of yours. A strange mix of mockery and superstition, but also a reminder that people could not help but laugh at the absurdities around them. After all, when scandal becomes normal, Laughter is one of the few comforts left. You can almost hear that laughter now rising from the alehouse down the road, where men and women with calloused hands mock the very rules they cannot escape. Walk into that alehouse for a moment. The smoke is thicker here, the benches crowded, the tables scarred with knives. A man tells a story of a cousin bride who ran away on the wedding night, choosing instead to live in sin with a travelling peddler. Another woman recalls how her own cousin husband died of a fever, leaving her to inherit both his goats and his debts. The room chuckles, but behind the chuckle is recognition. Everyone has a cousin story, and few of them end happily. Back at the manor, cousin marriages created quieter miseries. A young bride, forced to marry her cousin twice her age, finds herself watched by her own family, trapped between kinship and obedience. She cannot complain to her mother arranged it. She cannot flee to her uncle, he is the groom's father. She is wrapped like a fly in a web spun of family threads. Years pass, and she grows hollow-eyed, her children pale from winter hunger, her laughter fading into the cold corners of the hall. Such misery does not erupt in shouts or scandals. It lingers, silent, like a candle burning down to nothing, but sometimes scandal burst bright. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose marriages reshaped kingdoms, and whose kinship ties created endless disputes. When power was at stake, cousins became pawns, and pawns sometimes became queens. And though her story shines with grandeur, remember that behind every royal cousin union lay dozens of peasant cousin marriages, unnoticed except by the neighbors who love to whisper. The grandeur of nobility only magnified what ordinary people endured daily, the strange entanglement of blood and vows. You wonder, listening to all this, whether scandal was really the right word. Perhaps it was not scandal at all, but inevitability. In small communities, with few choices and many mouths to feed, marrying a cousin was as ordinary as sharing the same bread oven. The church thundered, yes, but thunder rolls away, and people still had to marry someone. Yet, because the church thundered, each of those marriages carried the flavor of sin, the whisper of disobedience. It was this contradiction, ordinary necessity dressed as scandal, that gave medieval marriages their peculiar suffocating air. Picture now the bedding of cousins. The hall grows loud, shoes thrown again, the bed dragged forth. The bride blushes not from innocence, but from recognition. The man beside her is the boy who once tugged her braids. The guests cheer, but beneath the cheer there is discomfort, a sense of something slightly bent, slightly off. And in the corner, an old woman mutters that children born of such a union will be cursed with thin bones. You see the way rumor, religion, and necessity wrap together, like cords twisting a bundle too tightly. As night deepens, the scandal does not end at the wedding. It lingers in inheritance disputes, in whispered doubts about legitimacy, in feuds sparked when cousins turned into rivals. Families tore themselves apart with lawsuits, tracing lineages until scribes grew dizzy. Even today, when you read medieval documents, you see how much ink was spilled on this subject. Not on love, not on tenderness, but on whether one cousin was too close to another. It is as if the entire medieval world kept tripping over its own tangled family tree. And so, when you lie awake tonight, you might smile wryly. You have seen how medieval marriages were not the fairy tale unions of ballads, but arrangements haunted by kinship and calculation. You have walked through halls thick with cousin brides, priests grumbling about canon law, neighbors gossiping, children growing up beneath the shadow of both scandal and survival. You know now why candles at a cousin's wedding flickered oddly, why feasts tasted of both joy and unease. The air itself was heavy with cousin marriage, carrying whispers that outlasted even the vows themselves. The bells of the small parish church toll across the valley, their sound drifting through mist that clings to the meadows. You follow the echoes into the nave, where sunlight spills through narrow slits of glass and turns the smoke of incense into wavering ribbons. Here, the rules of marriage are written not on parchment alone, but on the very stones. The priest in his vestments declares what is lawful and what is forbidden, what is sacred and what is scandal. Yet, as you listen to the words rise and fall, you sense how often they clash with the reality outside these walls. The church might thunder, but thunder does not stop the rain. From the pulpit you hear that marriage must be entered with free will, that cousins within 7 degrees must avoid each other, that adultery is mortal sin, that clandestine vows spoken without witness are invalid, and yet, by the time the congregation leaves, these laws scatter like sparrows before a plough. Families arrange unions with cousins despite the threat of consanguinity. Lovers whisper vows by moonlight, despite the need for witnesses. Lords pressure their daughters despite the demand for consent. It is as though the church writes in ink while the world writes in fire, and the flames always burn bright. One example comes to mind. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, the rules of kinship were shortened from 7 degrees to 4. This sounds technical, but it was a revolution. Suddenly, half the couples who had once been considered too closely related could breathe easier. It was as if a strict teacher finally admitted that the test had been impossible all along. But the very need to relax the rule showed how impractical it had been. Almost everyone in a medieval village was related somehow. Avoiding cousins entirely would have left too many fields untilled, too many alliances unmade, so the church bent, reluctantly, and in the bending revealed its own weakness. The irony, of course, is that while priests preached chastity and restraint, some of them lived in ways that raised eyebrows. Parish gossip often included not only who was marrying whom, but also which cleric had a mistress hidden in the next village. The scandal of the shepherd sometimes outshone the scandal of the flock. If the priest could bend rules for himself, how could his warnings about cousin marriage or clandestine vows carry full weight? It is a question villagers muttered over mugs of ale, though they rarely dared to say it aloud in daylight. At the same time, the church wielded tremendous power in deciding which marriages were valid. Annulments could shatter families. Imagine standing before a bishop and hearing him declare that your marriage of 10 years was never valid because of some obscure kinship tie. Suddenly, your children's legitimacy is questioned, your dowry thrown into dispute, your very honor erased. The law of the church could act like a blade, cutting through lives as easily as slicing bread, and behind that blade there was often money, a bribe for a dispensation, a gift for a judgment, a fee for paperwork. Scandal lingered not only in the beds of married couples, but in the very courts of canon law. Step outside the church now and follow the narrow road to the village green. Here, people repeat the rules as though they were charms. "You must have banns read 3 times, says one woman, "or else the marriage is cursed," another adds. "If you do not wed before the altar, God will not bless your bed." Yet in the same breath, they tell stories of secret unions in barns, of widows remarrying without permission, of couples exchanging vows over clasped hands by a river. The rules were known, yes, but they were bent, stretched, ignored, and sometimes laughed at. It was a game of cat and mouse, except the cat wore vestments and the mouse wore a bridal veil. Consider clandestine marriages, which the church detested. All it took was 2 people to exchange vows of consent. "I take you as my husband, I take you as my wife." And the marriage was, in theory, binding. No priest, no witnesses, no feast, just words. Lovers clung to this loophole like ivy to stone. Parents might arrange cousins for wealth, but children might slip away and speak these vows for love. When discovered, chaos followed. Families sued each other, bishops intervened, lovers were dragged apart. Yet enough clandestine unions survived to prove that rules could never wholly control desire. You can almost hear the whispers of one such story, a young man and woman meeting at night beneath the churchyard yew tree, speaking vows in trembling voices, sealing them with nothing more than clasped hands. Their hearts race with defiance, but by morning scandal pours over them like cold water. Parents rage, neighbors gossip, priests lecture, and still their words echo in their ears. "I take you," that simple formula could shake families more than any papal decree. Even at the highest levels of society, rules collided with reality. Kings and queens maneuvered marriages like chess pieces, only to find the church interfering. Henry VIII's famous break with Rome centuries later had its seeds in these constant disputes. Was his marriage to Catherine of Aragon lawful, given she had been wed to his brother first? Dispensation had been granted, yes, but whispers of invalidity lingered, ready to burst when politics demanded. The entire English Reformation, in a way, sprouted from the tangled soil of church rules and broken rules of marriage. Scandal was not confined to peasants and cousins, it stretched its fingers into thrones. But let us return to the smaller scandals, the kind you'd hear in every medieval market. A miller complains that his daughter has been forced to wed without her banns being read, and now the marriage is said to be cursed. A widow insists her neighbour's clandestine vows are invalid, so his children will never inherit. A group of women gossip that the priest who preached against cousin marriages was himself seen visiting his housekeeper late at night. The market fills not only with cabbages and wool, but with whispered scandals, every one of them tangled in the church's web of rules. Sometimes the rules protected the vulnerable. The idea that both parties must consent gave brides a sliver of defense against forced unions. A girl might cry out at the altar, "I do not consent," and the priest could, in theory, halt the ceremony. Yet in practice, the weight of family pressure often drowned her voice. Still, the fact that the church acknowledged consent at all was remarkable. It planted seeds that centuries later would grow into ideas of personal freedom in marriage. The irony is sharp. The same institution that tangled people in cousin marriages and annulments also gave them the very words to resist. The contradictions multiplied endlessly. Priests demanded bans, but tolerated secret vows. They thundered against kinship, but granted dispensations for gold. They preached purity, but were whispered to sin themselves. They insisted on consent, but often turned away when consent was forced. Marriage in the medieval world was less a sacrament, shining pure and more a patchwork quilt, stitched from law, custom, money, and scandal, with seams always fraying. And if you smile faintly now, it is because you recognize that people then were not so different from people now. They broke rules, bent them, laughed at them, obeyed them only when convenient. They married cousins for land, whispered vows for love, bribed priests for dispensations, and gossiped about it all over mugs of ale. The human heart beat stubbornly against the cage of canon law, and the result was both tragedy and comedy, misery and mirth. In the end, the church's rules shaped medieval marriages not by erasing scandal, but by defining it. Every union carried a shadow. Was it lawful? Was it valid? Was it blessed? These questions hummed in every feast hall, in every parish church, in every gossip circle. And when the candles burned low and the hall fell quiet, couples lay side by side, knowing that their marriage, however solemnly blessed, was also a knot of rules half followed, half broken. That knot, once tied, was not easily undone. The smell of boiled cabbage clings to the rafters of the manor kitchen, heavy and sour, mingling with the sharper scent of onions and smoke. The cooks bang pots, their sleeves rolled up, their chatter quick and weary. Tonight, a marriage contract has been sealed, and the feast is both celebration and transaction. You sit in the corner, watching as servants carry trenchers of coarse bread and jugs of thin ale. Yet your eyes are not on the food, they drift instead to the chest at the far end of the room, where the bride's dowry waits. Bolts of wool, a few brass candlesticks, and a coffer of coins that glints like captured sunlight. That chest is her true voice in this marriage, the measure by which she is weighed, valued, and traded. Dowries were more than gifts. They were survival insurance, bargaining chips, and chains all at once. A father who could not scrape together enough coin or livestock often watched his daughter languish unwed, her worth diminished in the eyes of neighbors. A wealthy father, meanwhile, paraded his daughter's dowry like a badge of pride, ensuring her a match that elevated the entire family's standing. For brides themselves, the dowry was both blessing and burden. It gave them leverage, but it also made them objects of calculation. You can almost hear them muttering, "She brings 20 acres and 2 cows, good value even if her nose is too long." Sometimes dowries included the strangest things. One record from medieval Italy mentions a bride bringing a feather bed, a set of silver spoons, and a parrot, a peculiar symbol of wealth and novelty. In rural England, it might be nothing more than a cow, a spinning wheel, and a stack of homespun linen. In both cases, the meaning was the same. A woman's body was bound to property. Without property, her body alone was rarely enough, and so brides were turned into bundles of goods, measured as much by inventory as by character. At the feast, the bride's hands rest in her lap, her eyes lowered. She knows every item in that chest, every blanket, every bowl. They were stitched and gathered over years of preparation, a slow surrender to a future not chosen by her. Each thread in the cloth speaks of her silent labor, hours bent over spinning and weaving, all so that she might be accepted as worthy. Yet the worth is not hers to hold. It slips from her hands into her husband's household. What was once her father's treasure becomes her husband's claim. She is caught in between, a vessel transferring wealth from one man to another. The misery of it grows clearer when you remember how fragile those promises could be. If a husband died young, the dowry was supposed to protect the widow, granting her security in her later years. But families quarreled, lawsuits blossomed, and widows were often left with little more than scraps. Even noble women, whose dowries included castles and gold, found themselves pleading with church courts to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. And if noble women struggled, what hope had a peasant girl with nothing but a cow and a chest of linens? Marriage contracts were written with more care than love letters. Scribes dipped quills in ink, tracing out every clause, the amount of coin, the rights to pasture, the promises of livestock. Sometimes the contract mentioned the bride by name, but just as often she was described in passing, a line in the margin, as though she were a detail in a trade agreement. Fathers haggled like merchants at a fair, their voices sharp, their eyes calculating. Love, if it appeared at all, was the faintest shadow behind the parchment. It is not hard to imagine the jokes told at these feasts. A cousin leans across the table, better she comes with coin, for she comes with little else. Another smirks, at least the cow gives more milk than she will laughter. Such jests, cruel and casual, expose the heart of the system. The bride is not knowed for her spirit, her wit, or her kindness, but for the good she carries. If she dares to speak back, she is branded proud. If she remains silent, she is considered meek. Either way, her fate is sealed by the dowry chest. The church tried, sometimes, to temper this harshness. Priests preached that dowries were sacred, not to be misused, that men should cherish their wives beyond wealth. But sermons did not stop hungry stomachs or greedy hands. Property disputes filled parish courts, and dowry chests became symbols of bitterness more often than security. A woman who brought a rich dowry might be envied, her sisters resenting her favor. A woman with a poor dowry might be pitied, her life spoken of as though it were already a tragedy. In both cases, the dowry overshadowed her humanity. Among peasants, the system was looser, but no less heavy. A father might scrape together seed grain, a piglet, or even a promise of labor owed to his son-in-law. These dowries were small, but they mattered. A man without a dowry bride might never build his farm strong enough to feed children, and so, once again, love bent beneath necessity. A girl's heart might lean toward the shepherd at the edge of the wood, but her father's eye measured instead the plough team of a sturdier suitor. The dowry spoke louder than desire. In noble courts, the dowry could shift kingdoms. Princes married princesses not for beauty but for provinces, castles and alliances. Eleanor of Aquitaine brought half of France as her dowry, her marriages changing the fate of Europe itself. Imagine being reduced to a continent-sized bargaining chip, your body carrying the weight of wars and treaties. And though your own dowry might be nothing more than a goose and a spindle, the principle was the same. Across every rank, the dowry tied women to wealth in ways that silenced their own voices. Yet scandal always crept in. What if a promised dowry failed to appear? What if the chest was lighter than agreed? Families erupted into feuds, accusing one another of deceit. Some brides were returned like faulty goods, their marriages annulled because the dowry never materialized. It sounds absurd, a woman treated like a shipment gone missing, but such cases litter medieval court records. The misery of a bride sent home humiliated, her reputation tarnished, was deeper than any scandal whispered in alehouses. And then there was the cruelest irony. The very wealth meant to protect women often endangered them. A bride with a rich dowry became a prize worth stealing. Tales abound of heiresses kidnapped and forced into marriages by ambitious men, their dowry chests seized as spoils. Picture a girl bundled onto a horse, carried off in the night, her dowry transformed from promise into ransom. Her screams echo across the moors, but the law moves slowly, and by the time it arrives she is already a wife in name, if not in spirit. The silence of misery returns here, as it always does. Imagine lying awake in a cold chamber, your dowry chest at the foot of the bed, its brass fittings glinting in moonlight. It is yours, and yet not yours. It marks you as valuable, and yet reduces you to value. You pull the covers tighter and realize that your future has been measured, weighed and bargained long before you spoke your vows. The chest creaks faintly in the dark, like a reminder that your life is no longer your own. And so, when people speak of medieval marriage as scandalous, it is not only because of adultery or cousins or broken vows, it is because of the quiet scandal of dowries, the way love was smothered beneath ledgers, the way women were turned into transactions, the way laughter faded into silence, while fathers counted coins. Each chest, whether filled with gold or with homespun cloth, carried both promise and despair. And in every hall, in every village, in every castle, the weight of those chests pressed down like a stone on the heart. If you lean close to the fire now, you might hear the faintest echo of those voices, women whispering about dowries too small, men boasting of dowries too great, priests sighing over contracts written with more care than prayers. The scandal lies not in one chest alone, but in the endless repetition, generation after generation, until the very air of medieval marriage smells not of roses but of boiled cabbage and smoke. The parchment lies unrolled across the table, its ink still gleaming wetly in the candlelight. The notary dips his quill again, scratching neat Latin clauses, while the gathered families look on. The smell of sealing wax curls in the air, acrid and sweet, binding words to fate. You watch as the bride's father leans close, his brow furrowed, as though one misplaced word might cost him a pasture. The groom's uncle coughs impatiently, tapping his ring against the wood, and in the middle of it all, the bride herself sits stiff-backed, her veil falling forward like a curtain hiding her expression. Tonight's wedding is less a tale of romance than a ledger brought to life, love letters drowned beneath legal contracts. Marriage in the medieval world was wrapped tightly in documents and agreements, often far more binding than the vows whispered in church. The contracts laid out everything the dowry promised, the inheritance rights secured, the duties expected. Even the faintest details found their way into ink. Was the bride entitled to her widow's portion if her husband died? Would the land return to her family if no children were born? These questions, inked carefully before any feast or ceremony, mattered more than whether the groom's eyes warmed at the sight of her. To love was optional, to sign was compulsory. A noble marriage might involve weeks of negotiations. Lawyers and clerics argued over clauses, tracing ancestry to ensure claims were secure. Sometimes the groom and bride never met until the contract was already settled, their futures decided in the dry language of obligation. Imagine stepping into a life not chosen, armed only with a set of terms you never wrote. Love could bloom later, perhaps, but it began as an afterthought, if it began at all. A sigh, hidden behind a veil, was the only rebellion a bride could safely show. In villages, the documents were simpler, but no less sharp. A father promised 2 cows and a field. The groom pledged his ploughing labor and loyalty, and the priest recorded it all. Even there, parchment meant permanence. Neighbors could gossip, but they could not unmake what had been sealed. The couple themselves might smile shyly at each other, but their shy glances carried little weight compared to the black strokes of ink binding their lives together. For every whispered word of affection, 10 lines of legal terms stood ready to silence it. Love letters did exist, of course, but they were fragile things, carried secretly by messengers or scrawled clumsily by hands more accustomed to ploughs than pens. Some have survived, verses where a man compares his beloved to spring flowers, where a woman promises faithfulness despite distance. These letters pulse with yearning, but they were the exception, not the rule. For most, love was a quiet hope, pressed between the pages of documents that never mentioned it. Imagine the frustration of hearts forced to write in margins, while lawyers filled the main lines. And yet, scandal thrived in those margins. A woman betrothed by contract might send a hidden note to another man, whispering of her misery, hinting at escape. A husband might find letters not meant for him, sparking lawsuits and accusations of adultery. Courts heard cases where love letters were read aloud as evidence, the tender words transformed into weapons. See, one lawyer argued, her affection lay elsewhere, her contract here invalid. What began as fragile poetry ended in public humiliation. Love, dragged into the open, became a scandal in itself. Consider the nobility again, where contracts could decide kingdoms. When Isabella of Angoulême married King John of England, her dowry and claims ignited wars with France. Behind the grand banners and trumpets stood parchments scribbled in legal Latin, binding more than hearts. Every noble marriage was a treaty disguised as romance. The bride's smile at the altar meant little compared to the wax seal pressed firmly beneath her name. She might walk proudly in jewels, but each jewel was an obligation, each thread of her gown a reminder of promises written long before she was consulted. The church, predictably, insisted that marriage was a sacrament first and a contract second. Priests preached that love, consent, and holy blessing mattered more than any parchment. But in practice, even the church played along with the paperwork. Bishops validated or annulled marriages based on the strength of documents, not whispered affections. Canon lawyers grew rich passing clauses, while ordinary couples prayed that their vows might outlast the ink. The holy and the legal blurred together until even God's will seemed to be written in notarial hand. For peasants, the gap between love and law was often cruelly obvious. A girl might meet a boy at the village well, her heart stirred by a laugh or a glance. Yet when her father arranged a marriage contract with another family, her heart's protest mattered little. She could clutch the memory of that laugh like a secret jewel, but it would never appear in the contract that transferred her to another household. Love was spoken in whispers while obligation was shouted in ink. The scandal lay not in her feelings but in their invisibility. Still, people found ways to bend the rules. Some contracts were deliberately vague, leaving space for negotiation if love managed to grow. Others were broken outright, with couples eloping before the ink was dry. Families dragged them to court, citing breach of contract, as though marriage were no different from a failed grain delivery. The courts, weary with such cases, alternated between punishment and reluctant mercy. You can almost imagine the scribes rolling their eyes, another pair of lovers refusing to follow the terms. Humour slipped in too. Jesters at noble feasts mocked contracts by mimicking lawyers, reciting absurd vows in parody. I, Thomas the Fool, do wed my dinner to my belly, with rights to wine and pie, signed in gravy and sealed with crumbs. The guests laughed, but the laughter carried an edge. Everyone knew the truth, that their own vows had been no less absurd, though written in finer ink. The scandal of contracts was too obvious to ignore, so they laughed to soften its sting. The misery, though, ran deeper. Imagine lying beside your husband, the wax seal of your contract still fresh in memory. His breath is heavy with ale, his words blunt and unfamiliar. You think of the parchment that bound you to his house, and you realize that every night henceforth will be shaped by it. Love letters may flutter in secret drawers, but they will never outweigh the contract folded in your father's chest. You close your eyes, the darkness heavy, your life already written by others. Sometimes the contracts even outlived the people. Disputes dragged on for decades, with children suing over terms made long before their birth. Old parchments were dragged from chests, their ink faded, their wax cracked, but their power still sharp. The dead hand of the past ruled the living, and marriages became less about affection than about the weight of words written generations earlier. In this way, misery seeped across time, binding not just couples but entire families in chains of obligation. And yet, amid all this, love still flickered. A secret letter slipped into a sleeve, a whispered word exchanged across a crowded hall, a look that lingered longer than custom allowed. These small rebellions, fragile though they were, became lifelines. They rarely overturned contracts, but they reminded couples that affection could survive even in the margins. If scandal followed, so be it. Better scandal than silence. You might smile faintly now, imagining some weary scribe, centuries later, pausing in his copying to tuck away his own love note, hidden in the folds of parchment. When you step back from the table where the contracts lie, you see the larger truth. Medieval marriage was not just about cousin unions or church law, but about the way ink smothered passion. Legal contracts weighed heavier than love letters, and the misery of it was not always loud. It was the quiet despair of brides who never received a letter of affection, only a contract of property. It was the scandal of lovers whose tender words became evidence. It was the laughter of jesters, mocking vows no one truly believed. And it was the silence of parchment, thicker than any veil, hiding love away. So, when you lie in your own bed tonight, safe from quills and wax, you might listen for the scratch of pens that once decided so many lives. You might imagine those sealed chests, those unread letters, those folded contracts that carried both wealth and sorrow, and you might feel the faintest sympathy for those brides and grooms whose hearts never made it onto parchment, whose love was left to flicker, faint and trembling, against the weight of ink. The hall is dim now, the fire reduced to glowing coals, but the air still trembles with the laughter of men who have drunk too much. You linger near the shadows, watching as the newly married groom slips away from the table, his boots dragging on the rush-strewn floor. His bride remains seated stiffly beside her mother-in-law, her gaze fixed on the cup in her hands. You know where he is going, though no one says it aloud. Out in the stables, or perhaps down in the buttery, a tryst waits, quick, reckless, and forbidden. This is the scandal that lived in the marrow of medieval marriage. Adultery in the shadows, whispered but rarely confessed. Adultery was the open secret of many households. Men, especially those of wealth or title, often felt free to wander beyond their vows. Priests thundered against it from the pulpit, citing commandments and eternal damnation, but their words often slipped like water over stone. A nobleman with land and soldiers could ignore a priest's scolding, while a peasant man could excuse himself with muttered jokes about sowing oats. The real cost, as always, fell upon women. If a wife strayed, scandal exploded like sparks in dry straw. The same act that earned a man a shrug could drag a woman to shame. Punishment, even the stake if charges of witchcraft were added for flavour. Consider Queen Isabella of France, accused of adultery with Roger Mortimer while still married to Edward II. Her affair toppled a king and reshaped England's fate, proving that the bedchamber could wield power sharper than swords. But for every Isabella, there were countless nameless wives and serving girls whispered about in alehouses, punished in courts, shamed in village squares. Adultery became not just a private choice but a public spectacle, a way for communities to reaffirm control by humiliating those who slipped outside the narrow path. Yet behind the scandal lay something almost pitiable. Imagine a young wife, wedded to an old gout-stricken husband chosen by her father. Her days are filled with silence, her nights with indifference. Then comes a chance encounter, a stable boy with bright eyes, a neighbour who speaks kindly, a minstrel who lingers in song. Can you blame her heart for stirring, for reaching toward warmth denied at home? The church might call it sin, the village might call it scandal, but to her it is survival, a fleeting taste of affection in a life that feels otherwise barren. Men's infidelities, meanwhile, could grow outrageous. Chronicles describe lords maintaining entire households of mistresses, their children half acknowledged, their existence an open jest at feasts. One bishop wrote disapprovingly of knights who kept their paramours like falcons, richly dressed and fed, displayed at tournaments as trophies. The imagery is almost absurd, a man showing off his mistress like a prized hunting bird. Yet behind the absurdity is misery for the wife, forced to watch her dignity chipped away with every smirk and every cheer. Punishments for adultery varied, but they carried humiliation more often than mercy. A woman might be paraded through the streets with her hair shorn, forced to wear a sign declaring her sin. In some towns, she was locked in a pillory while villagers hurled insults, and sometimes worse, at her. Men were rarely treated so harshly. A fine, a scolding, perhaps a quiet confession to a friendly priest, and the matter was brushed aside. The hypocrisy burned brighter than any torch. It was not the act itself that defined scandal, but who performed it, and whether they had power enough to silence the whispers. Still, villages thrived on those whispers. You can almost hear the low voices in the marketplace. Did you see how late she returned from the well? And her husband away in the fields? Gossip was the true court, and its sentences were swift. Even the hint of adultery could ruin reputations, leading to broken alliances, lost dowries, or children declared illegitimate. Families tore themselves apart over suspicion alone, even when no proof existed. Scandal did not need facts, only imagination, repeated often enough to be believed. And yet, despite the risks, people continued. Lovers met in barns, in orchards, in the shadow of city walls. Some exchanged secret tokens, a ribbon, a lock of hair, a carved trinket. Others risked letters, smuggled beneath cloaks or hidden in baskets. These small gestures carried enormous danger. If discovered, they could ignite lawsuits, or worse. But in the stillness of night, when candles guttered low, such tokens glowed brighter than gold. Scandal, after all, is only scandal when others see it. In private, it was tenderness. The church tried to frighten people into obedience with tales of divine punishment. Priests warned that adulterers would burn in hellfire, their tongues gnawed by serpents, their bodies consumed by flames. Artists painted lurid images on church walls. Couples chained together, dragged by demons into gaping mouths of monsters. Children stared wide-eyed, wives shuddered, husbands laughed uneasily. But fear alone could not chain the heart. The very need for such terrifying images proved how often the sin persisted. If everyone obeyed, the paintings would not be needed. Among nobles, adultery sometimes served as a political weapon. Enemies accused queens of infidelity to weaken kings, or accused lords to break alliances. Even when untrue, the charge stuck like tar. A wife accused of adultery might be locked in a convent, her children disinherited, her name erased. It mattered little whether she was guilty. The scandal itself was enough. Truth was optional. Reputation was everything. And so the game of power twisted even private desire into public ruin. Yet, there were strange cases of indulgence. Some courts tolerated a nobleman's mistress openly, even inviting her to feasts alongside his wife. Chronicles tell of knights who rode into tournaments carrying their lovers' favors while their lawful wives looked on, stone-faced. The contradiction is striking. Adultery condemned in sermons, yet celebrated in spectacle. It was as if medieval society needed scandal, even while pretending to fear it. Without such tales, what would neighbors gossip about? What would ballads tease? What would give color to evenings by the fire? Humor softened the edge sometimes. A peasant at an alehouse might joke, "If my wife strays, at least she might bring back a better ploughman than me." Laughter rolled, the scandal eased into jest, but beneath the laughter was resignation. Fidelity was an ideal, not a guarantee. Marriage was a contract, yes, but passion slipped between its cracks. Everyone knew it, everyone whispered it, everyone laughed to hide the sting. The silence of misery returns in the image of a woman lying beside her husband, knowing he has spent the evening with another. She dares not speak. Her dowry would be lost, her children's inheritance threatened. She lies still, staring into the rafters, her heart heavy as stone. In another chamber, her mistress giggles, her life equally fragile, her position depending on the fickle affection of a man who may discard her tomorrow. Both women live in shadows, bound by a man's desire, their misery different but equally deep. And so adultery, whether whispered in barns or proclaimed in courts, became part of the very fabric of medieval marriage. It revealed the hypocrisy of gender, the fragility of reputation, the hunger for affection beneath cold contracts. It was scandal, yes, but also survival. Lovers risked everything for a taste of tenderness, even when the taste turned bitter. The torches burn low, the hall grows quiet, and still you sense the shadows moving, scandal slipping silently where vows could not reach. The courtyard smells of damp hay and horse sweat, the clatter of hooves ringing out as servants hurry to prepare for another day. You wander past the stables, through the wooden gate, and into the manor itself where tapestries hang heavy with dust. Here you see the noble marriage bed, carved oak, sheets of imported linen, a canopy embroidered with heraldic beasts. It looks magnificent at first glance, a place of splendor and rest, but look closer, and you sense how heavy the silence weighs between the husband and wife who share it. Gold cannot soften the chill that lies between two strangers. Noble marriages often looked grand, but they were gilded cages, misery draped in velvet. The lady of the house spends her mornings overseeing servants, counting loaves of bread, ordering bolts of cloth. She writes in a neat hand, but not for poetry, for accounts, for inventories, for the endless arithmetic of survival. Her husband, meanwhile, rides to hunt or sits in council, speaking of alliances and taxes. When they meet at table, their words are courteous, their smiles practiced, yet beneath the formality lies a void. They are allies, not lovers, bound by family strategy rather than mutual affection. Imagine lying down beside someone every night, knowing that your life was tethered to theirs not by choice but by calculation. The peasants, too, lived marriages shaped by necessity, though theirs were rougher, more immediate. In a thatched cottage at the edge of the field, a husband and wife sleep on a straw mattress, the smoke of their hearth curling into the rafters. Their hands are cracked from labor, their backs bent from plowing and spinning. They share everything: hunger in winter, blisters in summer, the laughter of children, the grief of losing them. Yet even here, misery takes root. The wife may find herself tethered to a man who drinks away what little they earn, or a man who beats her when the harvest fails. Divorce is impossible, escape unthinkable. For peasants, marriage was less a cage of gold and more a cage of mud, but the bars were just as strong. The contrast between noble and peasant misery is striking. Nobles had tapestries to hide behind, peasants had walls of wattle and daub, but both faced unions where choice was scarce and silence heavy. In one hall, a lady might glance at her embroidery, dreaming of minstrels' songs while her husband drank with courtiers. In one hut, a wife might stir the pottage, dreaming of a kinder neighbour, while her husband snored on the bench. The trappings were different, but the ache was the same: the absence of tenderness, the weight of obligation, the grind of years spent beside someone you did not love. Scandals, too, look different at each level. Among nobles, gossip whispered of affairs with squires, secret meetings in gardens, bastards hidden in monasteries. Among peasants, scandal was simpler: a wife seen too often at the well with another man, or a husband caught sneaking to the alehouse widow's bed. In both cases, scandal fanned the embers of community chatter. Everyone loved a story, whether of a duchess caught with her knight or a shepherd caught with his neighbour's wife. The difference was that noble scandals could topple thrones, while peasant scandals toppled nothing but reputations. Consider the plight of a peasant bride who enters her husband's hut on the wedding night. The bed is little more than straw, stuffed in a sack, the fire dying low in the hearth. Her husband, weary from the feast, falls asleep quickly, leaving her to stare at the dark ceiling. She feels no thrill, no joy, only the cold certainty that this is her life now: labor, silence, children, and endless winters. Her misery may never make it into chronicles, but it is real nonetheless. Her scandal, if it comes, will be whispered at the well or muttered over fences, but it will sting just as sharply as the scandals of queens. In the noble chamber, another bride lies stiff under her embroidered canopy. She hears her husband's snores, smells the wine on his breath, and feels the loneliness spread like frost across her chest. Tomorrow she will rise and smile, directing servants as though all is well. But tonight she presses her face into her pillow and lets tears soak into silk. No one will speak of it, though perhaps her maid will notice her swollen eyes. Misery leaves fewer marks in noble halls, but it burns just as deeply. It is easy to imagine that peasants, at least, had the chance for affection, since their unions were often made within the village, among people who knew each other since childhood. But even there, affection bent beneath necessity. A girl might love the shepherd with quick hands and gentle eyes, but if the ploughman's family offered a pig and a half-acre of land, her father might choose the ploughman instead. Affection wilted beneath hunger, and so, even in cottages, Love was traded for bread. Nobles, in contrast, might never even meet their intended until the contract was signed. A young lady could be betrothed at 12, sent to live in her future husband's household to learn his customs, treated less as a bride and more as a hostage of alliance. Imagine the dread of growing up in the shadow of a stranger you are told you must someday call husband. She might write letters home, but her fate was already sealed. Her misery was slower, stretched across years, gilded in courtesy but bitter at the core. Of course, not every marriage was unhappy. Some peasants found kindness in shared labor, some nobles found respect in shared duties. But the structure itself leaned towards silence, toward endurance rather than joy. You can almost hear the sighs, the sigh of a lady at her embroidery, the sigh of a peasant woman scrubbing her pot, the sigh of a man staring into the hearth. These sighs, multiplied across centuries, create the soundscape of medieval marriage more truly than trumpets or church bells. Scandal often rose as a symptom of this silence. Affairs, elopements, secret vows, all were attempts to break free of cages gilded or muddy. A noblewoman might risk everything for a knight who looked at her with warmth. A peasant wife might risk gossip for a stolen kiss at the mill. The risks were immense. The punishments severe, but the desire for tenderness pushed people to reckless choices. Scandal was the scream inside marriages where voices were otherwise muted. And always, the community watched. A noble court buzzed with intrigue, every glance dissected by rivals. A village hummed with gossip, every late-night walk noted by neighbors. Privacy was rare, suspicion constant. Couples lived not only with each other, but with the eyes of dozens, even hundreds upon them. Scandal was not merely an act, it was the community's reaction to the act, magnifying it until it became unbearable. The silence of misery is clearest when you think of the children. A noble child grows up hearing whispered rumors about their mother's fidelity, their father's lovers, their own legitimacy questioned. A peasant child grows up seeing their mother's tired eyes, their father's drunken rages, neighbors gossiping at the well. For both, the marriage of their parents is less a lesson in love than a lesson in endurance. The cycle repeats, as they themselves grow to marry by contract or necessity, carrying the same silence into another generation. Picture now the two beds side by side in your mind. One noble, draped in velvet, the other peasant, stuffed with straw. In both, the couple lies together yet apart, bound by vows but separated by silence. Their surroundings differ, their wealth differs, their clothing differs, but the ache is the same. It is the ache of lives joined without tenderness, the ache of contracts heavier than hearts. Scandal buzzes like flies at the edges, but misery sits squarely in the center, silent, steady, unyielding. And so, whether in the smoky hut of a peasant or the glittering chamber of a noble, medieval marriage was marked by the same themes: silence, scandal, endurance, and the faint hope that affection might one day appear. Most nights it did not. Most nights the only company was the creak of the bed, the sigh of the fire, and the silence of hearts unconsulted. The morning sun slants through a narrow slit window, its light cutting across the chamber where a young girl sits with her hands folded in her lap. Her dress is too fine for her small frame, its sleeves hanging past her wrists, the embroidery heavy where her bones are still slight. Today she is to be wed, though her years are scarcely beyond childhood. The groom waiting for her in the hall is a man with hair streaked grey, his face lined from years of war and winter. This is not an unusual sight in the medieval world. Child brides and old grooms joined beneath a priest's blessing, their union less about affection than about inheritance, alliances, or the desperation of poverty. The clash of age and innocence filled countless chambers, and misery whispered through them all. For noble families, child marriage was a tool of strategy. A daughter might be betrothed at 7, her hand promised to a man decades older who held lands the family coveted. The marriage might not be consummated until she reached her teens, though even that came far too early for her body. She was sent to his household, raised more as a future possession than a free child, her laughter pressed into silence by the weight of expectation. Imagine being 12 and told that your duty was to bear heirs for a man old enough to be your grandfather. Childhood toys replaced with bridal veils. That was the reality for many noble daughters. Peasant girls, though less frequently married at such tender ages, were not spared either. In times of famine or hardship, a family might marry off a daughter early, simply to have one less mouth to feed. Her husband, often much older, might see her as a chance to secure labour and fertility in his declining years. She stepped from her father's smoky hearth into another hut barely different, yet the weight of responsibility pressed on her like stone. At an age when she might have been weaving garlands of daisies, she was weaving swaddling cloth for her first infant. The imbalance of power in such marriages was glaring. An older husband could command, discipline, even terrify his young wife with impunity. She lacked the age, the knowledge, the authority to resist. If she wept in the night, there was no one to hear. If she longed for a kind word, it might never come. The church blessed these unions, urging obedience and chastity, yet offered little comfort to the trembling girl beneath the covers. Priests preached that marriage was sacred, but sacredness did little to soften the blows of loneliness or fear. Consider Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, who gave birth at 13 after being wed to Edmund Tudor, a man in his mid-20s. Her body was barely strong enough, and childbirth nearly killed her. She survived, but many girls did not. Child marriage often led to early death in childbirth, their bodies too small for the task forced upon them. The statistics of mortality are chilling, but behind each number was a young girl's cry, lost to the centuries. Misery was not only emotional but often carved in flesh. And yet, scandal still clung to such unions. Neighbours whispered when a girl too young was led to church, their murmurs half sympathy, half judgment. "She is but a child," one woman might mutter, while another sighed, "but her father gains 2 fields." The contradictions were sharp. What was celebrated as a practical match in one breath became a scandal in the next. The very sight of such age mismatches reminded people of the cruelty woven into their own customs, even as they perpetuated them. The old grooms, too, carried their share of strange burdens. Some sought youth as a last grasp at vitality, hoping a young wife would bring laughter to their fading years. Others treated their brides coldly, seeing them only as wombs for heirs. A few perhaps found tenderness, but such cases were rare enough to be remarked upon in chronicles. More often, the age gap became a source of mockery. Jesters at courts mocked old husbands who fell asleep while their young wives longed for company, and ballads told of maidens sneaking away to younger lovers. Scandal became entertainment, even as misery remained private. Peasant songs sometimes carried humour too, though bitter at the core. One rustic rhyme warned, "Better wed a man with teeth than one with gold, for gold does not kiss you good night." The laughter of the singers rang out, but behind it lay the grim truth that many women had no choice. They married the man with gold, or with cows, or with land, even if his teeth had long since fallen. Their youth was traded for security, their innocence for survival. The church's role in these mismatched unions was double-edged. On one hand, it sanctioned them, declaring that once vows were spoken, the union was indissoluble. On the other, it sometimes intervened if a bride was too young, delaying consummation until she reached a suitable age. But suitable was flexible, often interpreted as soon as she reached puberty. 13, 14 years, when a girl's body was still unready, were deemed sufficient. The line between sacred blessing and sanctioned cruelty blurred until it vanished. Imagine the bedding of such couples, a spectacle as much as a ritual. Guests might accompany them to the chamber, tossing jokes and crude songs, the laughter of adults surrounding a frightened child. The old groom, perhaps embarrassed, perhaps indifferent, took possession while the room echoed with jeers. For the girl, it was humiliation etched into memory. For the community, it was eaten into. Scandal and cruelty blended together, leaving her silence as the only unspoken truth. Sometimes the young wives sought escape in small rebellions. A girl might linger longer at the well, exchanging shy glances with a boy her own age. She might refuse to rise from her bed, feigning illness to delay her duties. These tiny acts of defiance rarely changed her fate. but they gave her a moment of control in a life otherwise dictated by others. And when gossip noticed, scandal bloomed again. She avoids her husband, she looks too often at the miller's son. Even resistance became fuel for rumour. For the old grooms, scandal could sting too. An elderly man parading a child bride drew ridicule from neighbours. He weds a daughter to father a son, some sneered. If he failed to produce heirs, the laughter doubled. His bride grows but his seed withers. The cruel humour of communities exposed the awkwardness of such unions, though no one dared stop them outright. Instead, they endured, laughed about in taverns while misery continued behind closed doors. Children born of these marriages carried the contradiction forward. They were heirs, often securing dynasties, but they also bore the whispered reminders of their parents' imbalance. A noble child might be teased for having a mother barely older than himself. A peasant child might grow up hearing that his father married a girl still chasing chickens when he courted her. Scandal outlived the wedding, woven into family histories for generations. The silence of misery, though, remains the strongest image. Picture a girl barely 14, staring at her reflection in a basin of water, her veil too heavy on her head. She hears her husband coughing in the next room, his breath rattling with age. She knows she will spend her days bearing children, nursing him, burying him, and perhaps being married off again while still young herself. Her sigh ripples across the water's surface. No one hears it but you. And so medieval marriages were not only scandalous because of cousins, or contracts or adultery, but also because of these cruel mismatches of age. The innocence of girls was consumed by the needs of old men, the hunger for heirs, the greed for property. Communities laughed, priests blessed, fathers bargained, but the brides endured. Their voices rarely reached parchment, but their silence weighs heavier than ink. Scandal buzzed at the edges, but misery lay at the centre, steady as the toll of church bells. The banners ripple in the courtyard, each painted with lions, eagles, or lilies, their colours bright against the grey stone of the castle walls. Horns sound, not for romance but for diplomacy. Inside the hall, nobles gather in furs and silks, their voices buzzing like a hive. At the centre stands a bride, pale beneath her crown of flowers, and beside her, a groom whose hand trembles not with affection, but with the weight of a treaty. Here, marriage is not about hearts at all. It is about borders, kingdoms, and power. These are the marriages of state and strategy, colder than the parchment that records them, binding nations together even as they left couples staring across a gulf of indifference. A princess of France might be sent to England, her dowry securing peace for a generation. An English king's sister might be wed to a Scottish lord, her body a bridge across hostile lands. In these unions, the bride was a token, her smile rehearsed, her vows memorized. She could not refuse, not when her marriage promised to halt a war or forge an alliance. Imagine being shipped across the sea, carried away from familiar voices, only to find yourself among strangers who measured you not by your laughter but by the land you represented. It is no wonder that many such brides wept silently in their chambers, homesick and powerless. The scandal, of course, arose when these marriages failed to achieve their political purpose. Peace treaties dissolved, wars flared again, heirs failed to appear, or heirs appeared too many and too disputed. Each disappointment sparked whispers. Perhaps the bride was barren, perhaps the groom was unfaithful, perhaps the union was cursed from the start. The marriage that was supposed to bind nations instead unraveled them, and the individuals at its centre bore the shame. They became scapegoats for failures far larger than themselves. Consider the union of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, a rare case where political strategy and genuine affection appeared to coincide. Their marriage united Spain, their partnership strong, their goals aligned. Yet even here, the line between affection and politics blurred. Did their bond survive because they found true companionship, or because they both burned with the same ambition? Historians debate it, but for most couples of state, affection never even entered the conversation. Their lives were spent as symbols first, humans second. Think of Anne of Brittany, married first to Charles VIII of France, then after his death, to Louis XII. Her hand was claimed as fiercely as her duchy, her body treated as an extension of the land itself. Each time she walked to the altar, it was as though an entire province walked beside her, carried in her dowry. Did she find comfort in either husband, or was her heart buried with the freedom she lost, bound forever by politics? Her story was grand on parchment, tragic in flesh. Among nobles, strategy demanded not only first marriages but second, third, and more. Widows were remarried swiftly, their value recalculated according to their lands. A woman might bury her first husband with tears still fresh and be ordered to wed another within months. To her family, she was less a mourner than a pawn to be moved again on the chessboard of politics. Imagine standing at the altar in black, still grieving, while a priest intoned words of joy. The hypocrisy would have stung sharper than the chill of stone beneath her feet. Scandal often erupted when strategic marriages ignored personal desires. A princess might fall in love with a courtier, a nobleman might long for a mistress, but the treaty demanded otherwise. When those desires bled into public view, disaster followed. Kings accused queens of adultery to rid themselves of inconvenient wives. Nobles whispered about illegitimate children, threatening succession. A marriage built on strategy could collapse under the weight of human passion, its ruins scattering across entire kingdoms. Peasants, of course, watched these unions from afar, shaking their heads at the absurdity of royal scandals. Yet even in villages, echoes of strategy lingered. A wealthy farmer might marry his daughter to a man from another village to secure rights to grazing land. A miller might arrange his son's marriage to the baker's daughter, ensuring steady business. Though the scale was smaller, the principle was the same. Affection was secondary to advantage. The peasant bride, like the princess, carried not only herself, but her family's survival into the marriage bed. And yet, amid the grandeur of banners and treaties, the same silence of misery lingered. Picture a queen standing in her chamber, her gown heavy with jewels, staring out at a land she has been told she now belongs to. She does not speak the language, does not recognize the faces around her, and feels like a ghost in her own palace. She remembers her childhood garden, her mother's lullabies, her old nurse's smile, and knows she will never see them again. The treaty has stolen her past as well as her future. Sometimes humor softened the edge, though bitterly. Court poets might write sly verses mocking unions where the groom was decrepit or the bride visibly unwilling. Peasants sang songs about kings marrying golden cows or mute doves, laughter disguising criticism. Even the powerful could not escape ridicule, for everyone knew the truth. These marriages were not love stories, but cold contracts. The laughter was a way of surviving the chill. The church, naturally, cloaked these unions in holy language. Priests declared them blessed, sacraments ordained by God to bind nations in peace. But the irony was thick. The same church that blessed these marriages also annulled them when politics shifted. What was sacred one year might be sinful the next, depending on who sat in Rome and who ruled in the courts. The sanctity of marriage bent easily under the weight of kings. Children born of these unions carried dynasties on their shoulders. They were symbols of peace, heirs to crowns, living embodiments of treaties, but they also carried scandal with them. If legitimacy was questioned, wars erupted. If they resembled the wrong parent too much, whispers spread. Their very existence was scrutinized, their cradles watched with suspicion. Imagine being a child, your every breath measured against the fate of kingdoms. Affection was rare in such nurseries. Strategy hovered even over the cradle, and so, strategy often strangled joy. Couples who might have found companionship were forced apart, while others who loathed each other were bound tightly. The chessboard of politics cared nothing for human hearts. It moved pieces where it pleased, leaving trails of silence and misery. When you look at medieval history, the greatest wars and alliances often sprang not from battles or treaties alone, but from these cold marriages. Behind each banner was a bride who sighed in the night. Peasants whispered about noble unions with the same fascination that modern people gossip about celebrities. The king weds the emperor's niece, they murmured at market. Perhaps the wars will end, but they also shook their heads knowingly. And perhaps they will begin again. Even ordinary folk understood that these marriages of state were as fragile as cobwebs. easily torn, easily spun again. The scandal was less about who loved whom, and more about who betrayed which treaty. The silence of misery, however, was not confined to treaties and banners. It echoed in the hearts of the women carried across seas, the men forced to wed rivals' daughters, the children burdened with dynastic weight. Strategy forged kingdoms, yes, but it also carved scars into private lives. Behind every alliance was a chamber filled with sighs. Behind every treaty, a bride staring into the dark. The great halls may have roared with trumpets, but the bedrooms whispered only with silence. The night is cool, and the air hums with insects as you walk through a narrow medieval street. The cobbles are slick from the day's rain, and the shutters of houses stand half-closed, leaking orange lamplight into the gloom. You stop near a cluster of villagers gathered around the well, their voices lowered but urgent. They are not talking about the price of grain tonight. They are murmuring about the bride who was seen slipping from the woods at dawn, her hair unpinned, her eyes suspiciously bright. In a world where survival depended as much on reputation as on bread, gossip was a sharper weapon than any sword. The gossiping village was both stage and jury for every marriage, and its whispers made scandal louder than bells. Neighbours rarely needed proof. A lingering glance at market, a late return from the mill, a child who looked a little too much like the baker, each was enough to start tongues wagging. Once begun, rumour rarely stopped. It grew like ivy, twisting itself into new shapes, creeping across fences, climbing up church steps, wrapping families in shame. The bride could wake one morning innocent, and by evening be whispered about as cunning, sly, or unfaithful. She had no chance to argue her innocence. Her silence was twisted into guilt. For men, gossip carried risk too, though its sting was softer. A husband suspected of neglecting his wife might be mocked as weak, unable to keep her in line. A lord whose mistress bore children might be joked about at feasts, the laughter echoing louder than his protests. But women bore the sharper edge of rumour. For them, gossip could destroy dowries, annul marriages, leave children branded bastards. Villages thrived on scandal because scandal reaffirmed their own sense of order. Pointing out another's shame kept one's own hidden. Picture a peasant wife drawing water at the well, every step watched by her neighbours. They comment on how many buckets she carries, how she smiles when the miller's boy passes, how her hair escapes its veil. She cannot simply fetch water. She must fetch it without being seen as too quick, too slow, too friendly, too cold. Her life is a performance, her audience restless and unforgiving. Gossip is the applause and the hiss alike. In noble households, gossip festered even more dangerously. A queen's chambermaids whispered about her nightly habits, carrying stories to courtiers who repeated them at banquets. A baron's rivals accused his wife of bearing another man's child, not for truth but for leverage. Courts buzzed with rumour like wasps in summer, each sting capable of toppling alliances. A single whispered tale might travel from chamber to council, from council to chronicle, until it became truth recorded for centuries. Even royal marriages, sealed with treaties and sanctified by priests, could be undone by rumour born in a kitchen. The church tried to regulate gossip, calling it sin, urging confession. But priests themselves sometimes carried whispers between families, cloaked as warnings. One sermon might emphasize fidelity after hearing rumors of a noble's affair, while another might rail against greed after hearing of disputes over dowries. In this way, gossip shaped even sermons, turning pulpits into subtle echoes of village chatter. Sacred words bent around profane whispers. Some communities took gossip to public punishment. In England, a woman branded a scold or slanderer might be forced to wear the scold's bridle, an iron cage over her head with a metal tongue pressed against her mouth. In France, gossips might be dragged through streets on carts, mocked by their neighbours. The irony is sharp. Gossip was punished by creating more gossip. The entire village would gather, laugh and whisper about the punished woman, ensuring her shame lingered long after the iron was removed. And yet, gossip carried humour too, a cruel kind of entertainment. At alehouses, men joked about cuckolded husbands, drawing horns in the air with their fingers. Songs teased about wives who milked more than cows or husbands who wandered further than fields. People laughed because laughter softened the fear that scandal could strike their own door next. By laughing at others, they convinced themselves they were safe. Children, too, absorbed the whispers. A boy might be mocked at school for being the miller's son rather than his legal father's child. A girl might be warned not to end up like her shameless mother, even if the gossip was baseless. Rumor etched itself into generations, shaping identities and destinies long after the original scandal faded. The gossiping village was not content to punish the guilty. It punished descendants too. Imagine lying in your hut at night, the wind rattling the shutters, knowing your neighbors speak of you. You cannot silence them, cannot confront them, cannot prove your innocence. Tomorrow you must face them at market, their eyes sharp, their smiles thin. The silence of misery lies not in your bed alone, but in the space between you and your community, where every glance feels like a verdict. Scandal is not just what you do, it is what others decide you have done. Noble halls mirrored this torment. A queen might lie beneath embroidered canopies, yet still know that courtiers whispered outside her door. She might give birth and instead of joy hear murmurs. Does the child look like the king? Every triumph became suspicion, every silence filled with doubt. Power did not shield her, it magnified her vulnerability. The higher the crown, the sharper the whisper. Gossip sometimes toppled more than marriages. It could topple rulers. Rumors of adultery fueled rebellions. Rumors of illegitimacy sparked wars of succession. The Wars of the Roses were littered with whispers about who had rightful blood and who did not. Gossip became history, etched into chronicles that scholars still read, forgetting sometimes that those facts began as whispers in smoky halls. The gossiping village had no boundaries. It stretched from mud huts to royal courts, shaping destinies as surely as sword. And yet, people craved it. The marketplace buzzed with it. The spinning wheel circle thrived on it. Even monks in cloisters passed it between prayers. Gossip was the glue of community, the shared currency of belonging. To be excluded from gossip was to be invisible. To be its subject was to be trapped. Everyone wanted to listen. No one wanted to be spoken of. There is dark humor in this, of course. You can almost hear a peasant muttering, "Better they gossip about me than forget me." At least scandal kept one's name alive, and perhaps that is why even misery found a kind of endurance through gossip, because no matter how cruel, it meant you were seen, remembered, discussed. Silence might have been safer, but it was lonelier. So when you picture a medieval marriage, do not imagine only vows at the altar or feasts in the hall. Imagine the whispers at the well, the smirks at the market, the knowing looks at court. These were the true soundtrack of marriage, louder than bells, sharper than songs. The gossiping village never slept, and its whispers still echo in the chronicles left behind. The candle flames in the scriptorium flicker against the vellum, illuminating lines of Latin written by a weary monk's hand. He pauses, rubbing his eyes, before continuing his task of tracing out genealogies, names, marriages, children, alliances, all carefully ordered. The ink smudges slightly, and with that smudge an entire claim of inheritance may shift. You lean closer, and the truth becomes clear. Medieval marriages were tangled, not only in gossip and contracts, but in blood itself. Consanguinity, the snarl of kin marrying kin, haunted priests, scribes, and families alike, filling courtrooms and confessionals with endless disputes. The church's rules on kinship were strict at first. 7 degrees of relation barred from marriage. That meant cousins, second cousins, sometimes even people who barely remembered how they were connected. But in villages where families had intermarried for generations, nearly everyone was related somehow. The rules were impossible to follow. By the 13th century, the Lateran Council cut it down to 4 degrees. But still the problem persisted. Families bent the rules, priests ignored them, dispensations were purchased for gold. The result was a constant dance between law and reality, where scandal crept in every time the steps faltered. Picture a small parish where a couple stands before the altar. The priest halts, his brows knit. "You are related," he declares. "They are third cousins, both descended from a common great-grandfather." Technically forbid. The families protest. There are no other suitable matches. The dowry has already been paid, the feast already prepared. What then? Either they proceed in secret, risking scandal, or they trek to a bishop, begging for dispensation, their fate dependent on coin and favour. Their union may be lawful one day and scandalous the next, depending on who decides. Among nobles, the stakes were higher still. Royal bloodlines often looped back into themselves, weaving cousins into spouses, generation after generation. The Habsburg jaw, jutting and heavy, became the physical emblem of this practice, bred into descendants by centuries of marriages between kin. The scandal here was less whispered than obvious, etched in bone and face for all to see. And yet kings and queens continued, preferring to marry within their own circle rather than risk diluting power. What priests decried as sin, monarchs celebrated as strategy. For ordinary folk, the consequences were subtler. A peasant might marry a cousin, simply because no one else was available within walking distance. But if later challenged, perhaps in an inheritance quarrel, their children could be declared illegitimate. Imagine the despair of seeing your sons and daughters stripped of rights, not because of what they had done, but because of a rule you barely understood. Inheritance disputes turned into battlegrounds, parchments brandished as weapons, cousins suing cousins until fields lay fallow. The records of ecclesiastical courts overflow with such cases. One husband accused his wife of being too closely related, hoping to escape a union that no longer pleased him. Another family challenged a marriage after decades, seeking to disinherit children now grown. Priests interrogated villagers about bloodlines, asking questions that no one could fully answer. Whose daughter was your grandmother's sister? A single mistaken name could unravel entire lives. In such moments, scandal became less about love or betrayal, and more about paperwork, as though kinship was simply an accounting error waiting to be exposed. Still, villagers found humor in it. "We are all cousins here," one proverb declared, half mocking the church's rules. And indeed, in tight communities, nearly everyone was kin in some way. To forbid cousin marriage entirely was to forbid marriage altogether, so people laughed, shrugged, and carried on, muttering apologies to priests while whispering vows in barns and fields. If scandal followed, it was endured like winter frost, unwelcome but inevitable. Noble scandals, however, were anything but shrugged off. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriages, each tangled with kinship questions, each scrutinized for legitimacy. When kings and queens wed cousins, rival claimants pounced, declaring heirs invalid. Wars broke out, blood spilled, all because of disputes over how closely related two people were. Scandal here was not only personal but dynastic, reshaping entire nations. What began as consanguinity in bedchambers ended as carnage on battlefields. The irony was rich. Priests thundered about the dangers of incest, yet their dispensations allowed it to flourish among those wealthy enough to pay. The poor were punished, the rich excused. Villagers whispered about the hypocrisy, though never too loudly. It became another joke passed in alehouses. If you've coined for Rome, even your sister may become your bride. The laughter was nervous, edged with bitterness, for everyone knew it was half true. Children born of close unions sometimes bore the marks of frailty, a crooked limb, a weak constitution, a face too familiar in its features. Neighbors took these as proof of God's displeasure. Whether superstition or truth, the association between cousin marriage and weakness clung stubbornly. A mother wept not only for her sickly child, but for the whispers that followed. It is her own fault. She wed too close to her kin. Scandal was carved into the very bodies of children, their innocence no shield against rumor. And yet, despite the rules, despite the whispers, cousin marriage persisted century after century. The web of blood was too tight, the choices too narrow, the stakes too high. It was easier to risk scandal than to risk poverty or war. Families accepted the contradictions, priests muttered dispensations, neighbors gossiped but attended the feasts anyway. The system endured because no one could afford to tear it apart. Imagine now the monk in the scriptorium, tracing lines between names, trying to make sense of the tangled branches, his quill scratches, his ink blots, and still the tree refuses order. Cousins marry cousins, names loop back, alliances twist. He sighs, rubs his temples, and writes another line. knowing full well that the truth is less tidy than the page suggests. The family tree is more knot than trunk, and scandal grows from every knot. The silence of misery lingers in the chambers of those bound by these unions. A woman lies beside her cousin husband, her sigh muffled by the night. She knows he is kin, not stranger, yet the closeness brings no comfort. Instead, it brings the weight of inevitability, as though her fate were woven into her blood long before she spoke her vows. She cannot escape. To whom could she flee when all around are cousins too? The silence is her only refuge, her misery her only companion. At the same time, scandal lived loudly in courts and marketplaces. Neighbors pointed fingers, rivals sharpened claims, priests thundered, poets mocked. The word cousin carried both familiarity and suspicion, warmth and accusation. Marriage that should have united often divided, tearing families into camps, leaving villages buzzing with whispers. The echoes of those whispers reach you even now, centuries later, in chronicles that record disputes not of passion but of bloodlines. And so medieval marriage was never only about love or contracts or dowries. It was also about blood. How close, how far, how tangled. Consanguinity haunted every altar, every bed, every court. It made scandal inevitable, misery unavoidable, and silence unbearable. The candles burn low in the scriptorium. The monk's quill slows, but the knots in the tree remain. They always remain. The churchyard grass bends with the evening breeze as a bell tolls for the departed. You follow mourners into the nave, where candles flicker against stone walls dead by centuries of smoke. A coffin lies before the altar, draped in a simple cloth. The widow sits to one side, her veil heavy, her shoulders bowed. Her tears are fresh, but already her future is being whispered about. In the medieval world, widowhood rarely meant freedom. It was a doorway into another cycle of bargaining and vows. Whether wealthy or poor, widows were often forced into marriages they did not want. Their grief barely cooled before negotiations began anew. For noble women, widowhood was a matter of politics. A countess who buried her husband might find her hand promised to another lord within months. Her lands too valuable to be left unguarded. Even queens were not spared. Eleanor of Aquitaine was married off swiftly after her first husband's death, her body and lands shifting allegiance as if she were a chess piece. Imagine her sigh as she stood again at an altar, her heart unconsulted, her mourning cut short by strategy. For widows of rank, tears dried quickly under the weight of treaties. Peasant widows faced different burdens, but no less misery. Without a husband, they lost not only companionship, but also legal authority. A woman alone was vulnerable to hunger, to harassment, to suspicion. Communities often pressed her into remarriage for her own protection, though in truth it was often for the convenience of her neighbors. A widow with a plot of land became a tempting prize. Suitors arrived not with flowers but with calculations, measuring her dowry, her livestock, her usefulness. Grief was not private, it was public property. The church encouraged remarriage, but cloaked it in sanctity. Priests preached that widowhood should not linger too long, that women were made to be under men's guidance. Yet they also praised widows who remained chaste, calling them models of holiness. The contradiction was impossible. Too much chastity was praised but impractical. Too little chastity was scandalous. Widows walked a narrow road, their every step judged by gossiping tongues. Imagine the pressure of being told simultaneously that your holiness lies in silence, but your duty lies in remarriage. Some widows clung fiercely to independence. Records survive of women who refused suitors, managing their households alone for decades. They fought in courts to retain property, resisted pressure to remarry, and became figures of both admiration and suspicion. Neighbors muttered that such women were witches, too proud, too stubborn, but others admired their courage, even if quietly. These rare widows carved out lives of autonomy in a world designed to deny them such freedom. Their resistance itself became scandal, for independence was seen as rebellion. Widowhood also brought danger. Young widows, especially those with dowries, were at risk of abduction. Chronicles tell of women carried off against their will, forced into remarriage by men eager to seize their property. A widow walking in her garden might be dragged away by night, her screams muffled beneath cloaks, her fate sealed before she could resist. For her, widowhood was not freedom but a trapdoor into another prison. Scandal lived not only in whispers but in the violence of forced vows. In villages, widowhood reshaped social roles. A widow might be accused of causing her husband's death through negligence, witchcraft, or adultery. If she remarried too quickly, she was mocked for impatience. If she waited too long, she was criticized for pride. The gossiping village never spared her. Children bore the brunt too, mocked as orphans, their inheritance questioned. Widowhood was not a private condition, it was a stage upon which the whole community acted. Consider the bitter humour of rustic songs. Better the widow's tears than the spinster's sighs, men joked, mocking both grief and independence. The laughter was cruel, a reminder that women's suffering was entertainment as well as misfortune. Yet behind the jest lay truth. Widowhood was dangerous because it offered a glimpse of female independence, and society moved quickly to cage it again. In noble courts, the fate of widows became legendary. Some wielded power, ruling as regents for their children, their signatures shaping kingdoms. Others were shunted aside, their lands seized, their names forgotten. Queens could rise to prominence through widowhood, or vanish into convents, their lives reduced to cloistered silence. The variability itself was scandalous. A widow's future depended not on her will, but on the whims of men around her. Even the church wrestled with contradictions. The Virgin Mary was honoured as the model of perfect widowhood, yet ordinary widows were pressured to remarry. Priests thundered against lust while quietly arranging second marriages for wealthy widows in their parishes. Some widows entered convents, finding in the cloister the freedom denied them outside. But cloistered life was not always chosen freely. Sometimes it was the only escape from forced vows. Their prayers mingled with sighs, their chants with memories of freedom lost. The misery of widowhood was not only in remarriage but also in loneliness. Imagine sitting by the hearth in the quiet hours of evening, the bed empty beside you, the house too still. Even if your husband had been indifferent or harsh, his absence left a void. Neighbours might fill it with gossip, but silence filled it more deeply. Widowhood stripped life of its familiar rhythms, replacing them with uncertainty. To remarry meant surrender. To remain single meant scrutiny. Neither path offered peace. Scandal often sprang from the desperation of widows themselves. Some sought companionship outside the strict bounds of remarriage, finding lovers in secret. When discovered, the punishment was harsh: public shame, legal censure, children declared illegitimate. Yet their longing was human, born not from malice, but from the need for warmth in lives suddenly cold. Every affair of a widow became fodder for rumour, proof that she was either too weak or too willful. Either way, she was condemned. There is a strange irony in how widows were both feared and pitied. Men feared their independence, their wealth, their potential to disrupt alliances. At the same time, they were pitied as fragile, incomplete, in need of guidance. This double vision left widows trapped between suspicion and control. Their very existence was scandalous because it threatened the assumption that every woman must belong to a man. A widow, however briefly, belonged to no one but herself. The silence of misery deepens here. Picture a widow kneeling at her husband's grave, the cold stone pressing against her fingers. She whispers prayers, but behind them lies fear. What will become of her now? Her future is not hers to decide. She may be remarried, abducted, cloistered, or left alone, but she has little say in the matter. Her grief is real, but her autonomy is fleeting. The candles at the altar flicker as if mocking her, their light steady while her life falters. And so, widowhood in the medieval world was not the freedom it might appear today. It was another chapter of control, another stage for scandal, another silence of misery. Behind every veil of mourning lay calculations of property, gossip of neighbours, ambitions of lords. Widows carried grief, but they also carried the burden of a society eager to shape their futures. The bells toll again outside, their sound fading into night, but the whispers linger, wrapping widows in chains even as they weep. You said, continue, write exactly 1,450 words in 17 paragraphs pages for this section. The square smells of trampled hay and sweat, its cobbles slick with spilled ale from the tavern across the way. Villagers gather in clusters, their voices low with anticipation, their children darting forward to see. At the center stands the pillory, its wooden beams stained dark from years of use, its iron fittings cold under the morning sun. Today it will not hold a thief or a debtor, but a woman accused of breaking the holy bond of marriage. Adultery, the priest called it. Scandal, the neighbors whispered. Punishment, the steward declared. You step closer and feel the hum of the crowd. This is not justice only, it is theatre. The punishments of passion turned private choices into public shame. Adultery was considered a mortal sin, but the way it was punished varied wildly. Nobles with wealth might pay fines, confess to priests, or smooth matters over with bribes. Their scandals became stories in chronicles, half scandalous, half glorious. But for villagers, punishment was immediate and humiliating. Women caught in adultery were dragged to the square, bound in stocks, sometimes forced to wear shame masks shaped like animals, a donkey for foolishness, a pig for lust. The crowd jeered, children threw clumps of mud, neighbors muttered prayers too loudly, half in pity, half in scorn. Men rarely faced equal disgrace. A husband might be fined, his affair shrugged at, but rarely was he locked in stocks. The hypocrisy burned brighter than torches. In truth, these punishments were less about enforcing morality than about controlling women's bodies and ensuring the legitimacy of heirs. A wife's infidelity threatened property and inheritance in a way a husband's rarely did, and so her humiliation was performed publicly, a warning to every other woman watching. Sometimes punishments turned grotesque. In certain towns, adulterous women were paraded through the streets, bareheaded, their hair shorn as a symbol of shame. Others were forced to ride backwards on donkeys, mocked with crude songs as they passed. The spectacle mattered as much as the penalty. Scandal was not just whispered in alehouses, it was displayed in the square like a morality play. Children learned by watching, men laughed, women trembled. Fear spread further than the punishment itself. Yet even here, humour slipped in, bitter, biting humour. Jesters mocked cuckolds, drawing horns above their heads in gesture. Songs teased that husbands who ignored their wives grew cabbages in their beds. At markets, bawdy ballads were sung about adulterous lovers caught in haylofts. People laughed not because the misery was funny, but because laughter softened fear. As long as scandal belonged to someone else, it was safe to joke. It was easier to jeer at the punished than to confront how fragile one's own reputation truly was. Consider noble courts, where punishment rarely meant pillories, but could mean exile, imprisonment, or annulment. The queen accused of adultery risked not only her freedom, but her life. Anne Boleyn, centuries later, would face execution under such charges, the stark reminder of how passion became weapon. Even unproven rumours could condemn a woman, for scandal was often more powerful than truth. A whispered accusation, repeated often enough, became justification for punishment, whether deserved or not. The church added its own layers. Adulterers were ordered to confess, to fast, to perform public penance. Some walked barefoot through villages in sackcloth, carrying candles as crowds followed. Priests thundered that their souls were at risk, their punishment not only earthly but eternal. In murals and sermons, adulterers were shown tormented by demons in hell, their bodies consumed by fire, their tongues gnawed by serpents. Fear was the tool, shame the weapon, obedience the goal. And yet, scandal persisted. Lovers continued to meet in barns, in fields, in quiet corners of cloisters. Passion cared little for punishment. Each act risked ruin, but the hunger for tenderness in cold marriages was stronger than fear. If you look closely at the punished woman in the pillory, you might see not only shame but defiance in her eyes. Perhaps she loved truly, perhaps she risked knowingly, perhaps she would not take back her choice despite the crowd's jeers. Misery was certain, but passion had been worth it, if only for a time. Men caught in adultery sometimes faced harsher justice too, especially if their affairs disrupted alliances. A lord who seduced another noble's wife could find himself challenged to duels, stripped of lands, or even killed. In such cases, the punishment was not moral, but political, fueled by property and pride. The irony is sharp. Morality mattered little compared to insult and inheritance. Scandal, once again, was less about sin than about power. Villagers remembered these punishments long after the shame faded. Children grew up repeating the stories. Do you recall the miller's wife, the one paraded with no shoes? Memory stretched scandal across generations, weaving it into community lore. Even when forgiven by church or husband, the taint remained. A woman could live decades beyond her punishment, yet still be whispered about whenever she passed the well. In this way, scandal became a second sentence, one that outlived stocks and pillories. Sometimes punishment itself sparked scandal. Crowds occasionally grew unruly, mocking not the accused, but the officials who enforced the penalty. If a woman was beloved, neighbors might defend her, turning the spectacle into chaos. Chronicles note riots breaking out at such events. Villages split between those jeering and those protesting. In such moments, the community's hunger for justice clashed with its hunger for compassion, and scandal grew doubly. Scandal of the affair, scandal of the punishment. The silence of misery lingers strongest, though, in the aftermath. Picture a woman returning home after a day in the pillory, her skin raw from sun, her ears still ringing from jeers. She sits by her hearth, her children staring wide-eyed, her neighbors avoiding her gaze. No words are spoken, yet the silence weighs heavier than the crowd's noise. Her marriage, already fractured, now lies in shards. Her husband may forgive, or he may not. The village may forget, or it may not. Either way, her life is altered forever. Among nobles, the silence was suppler but no less painful. The queen, acquitted of charges, still faced cold eyes at court. A countess forgiven by her husband still endured whispers. Servants exchanged glances, scribes recorded rumors, poets hinted slyly. Silence surrounded her, but it was not peace, it was isolation. She might stand in halls of gold, yet feel as imprisoned as the peasant woman in the pillory. Even men, rarely punished so harshly, bore scars. A cuckolded husband endured endless mockery. Horns drawn in chalk on his door, songs sung at his expense. His silence, too, was misery, the silence of wounded pride, of laughter endured without reply. Punishment reached beyond the adulterer to touch everyone connected, turning marriage itself into a theatre of suspicion. And so the punishments of passion reveal how scandal was weaponized, how misery was magnified, how communities thrived on the suffering of their own. Pillories, sermons, whispers, even chronicles, all turned private desire into public shame. You stand now in the square as the crowd disperses, the pillory empty once again. But the whispers remain, carried on the wind, ensuring that passion punished today will be remembered tomorrow. The moon is high above the fields, pale light pooling on the dirt road that winds toward the forest. A horse clatters past, its rider clutching a girl in his arms. She struggles, her cries muffled against his cloak, but the night swallows the sound. In the distance, a village dog barks and then falls silent. This is no courtship, it is an abduction. In the medieval world, love was not always wooed with flowers or serenades. Sometimes it was stolen with force, or snatched in desperation, or claimed in flight. Abductions, elopements, and escapes of the heart filled chronicles and gossip alike, turning marriage into a battlefield where passion and power collided. Marriage by abduction was shockingly common, especially among noble families. Heiresses with rich dowries were tempting targets. A lord in debt or a knight eager for advancement might seize a young woman, wed her by force, and thus lay claim to her inheritance. Families protested, courts convened, priests argued, but often the marriage stuck. Once vows were spoken, even under duress, the church hesitated to annul them. The bride's tears counted for little compared to the coin her husband gained. Abduction became less crime than strategy, a brutal shortcut to power. One famous case involved Margaret of Beverley, dragged from her kin by a suitor determined to seize her lands. Though her family fought bitterly for her return, the marriage stood, leaving her bound for life to the man who had stolen her. Imagine her silence at the altar, her hands trembling as she repeated vows she did not wish to speak. The priest may have hesitated, the congregation may have whispered, but the ink dried just the same. Scandal here was not hidden, it was blatant, painted across the whole community. Elopements, by contrast, carried a different flavor. Lovers who could not win approval fled into the night, seeking chapels or sympathetic priests who would bind them quickly. A girl promised to her cousin might flee with the boy she truly loved, their footprints vanishing into the woods as her family scoured the fields by torchlight. Elopements were thrilling, reckless and dangerous. If caught, the couple faced humiliation, imprisonment, sometimes even annulment. But if they succeeded, they carried with them a small victory against a system built to deny them. For peasants, elopement was sometimes the only way to assert choice. For nobles, it was treason against family strategy. Communities gossiped endlessly about these escapes. Some admired the boldness. Better she fled with love than lived in misery. Others sneered. She dishonored her kin. She spat on their plans. Either way, the eloping couple rarely found peace. Their scandal followed them, staining their children, shaping their futures. They became tales told at hearths. Do you remember the girl who ran with the shepherd? Her children still pay for it. Even in success, scandal lingered like smoke. Not all abductions were violent. Some blurred into collusion, where a woman feigned abduction to escape a marriage she dreaded. Chronicles record women leaping onto horses willingly, yet later claiming force to protect their honor. The line between choice and coercion blurred until even priests could not discern it. Was she stolen or did she flee? Was her silence fear or consent? Scandal grew from the uncertainty as much as from the act itself. The church thundered against both abduction and elopement, declaring them sins and urging obedience to parental consent. Yet canon law still recognized that vows spoken freely, even if in secret, were binding. This contradiction fueled endless dispute. Families dragged couples before bishops. Priests argued over confessions, courts filled with parchment. A stolen bride could be both sinner and lawful wife. A runaway couple could be both blessed and condemned. The tension was inescapable. Punishments varied. Some abductors were fined heavily, their estates seized, their reputations ruined. Others were rewarded, their forced marriage accepted as fait accompli. Elopers might be reconciled with families after long disputes, or they might be disowned entirely. A runaway noble daughter could find herself stripped of inheritance, cast out like a stranger. A peasant girl might find herself returned home in disgrace, her reputation ruined forever. The outcomes were inconsistent, but the misery was constant. And yet there was a strange romance to these tales. Minstrels sang of lovers fleeing into the night, of knights rescuing damsels from cruel fathers, of girls braving forests for the sake of affection. The songs softened a scandal into story, painting abductions as gallant rescues and elopements as triumphs of love. But reality was harsher. For every ballad, there were countless women whose screams never reached a minstrel's lute, whose tears were shed in silence while their reputations burned. Villages treated abductions with a mix of outrage and amusement. A girl carried off was pitied, but also mocked. She must have wanted it. A family humiliated by a runaway daughter endured jokes for years. Even when marriages endured, the community never forgot. Gossip turned into folklore, and folklore etched itself into memory. Scandal became heritage, carried like a noble courts. Meanwhile, recorded abductions in chronicles as both crime and comedy. Chroniclers described knights storming castles to seize unwilling brides, their exploits dressed in chivalric language. The violence was hidden beneath flourishes. He carried her as Mars carried Venus. The truth, her terror, her lack of choice, was smothered by ink. Readers centuries later see only the romance, forgetting the misery. But in the silence of the women themselves, the truth lingers. They were pawns, prizes, prisoners. Humor crept into even the darkest corners. A rustic rhyme mocked abductors who failed. He stole the bride, but not her heart. She wept so loud they dragged apart. Villagers laughed, but the laughter hid unease. Everyone knew it could happen to their daughters, their sisters, themselves. Joking softened fear, but it did not erase it. Imagine a girl sitting in a strange chamber after abduction, the fire unfamiliar, the faces around her hostile. She touches the veil forced onto her head, her hands shaking. Outside, villagers feast, gossip and laugh, but inside she feels only silence. Her future has been stolen as surely as her body. Whether her abduction is called marriage or crime, the misery is the same. She whispers prayers into the darkness, but even God seems far away. And then, picture another girl slipping into the night with her lover, her heart pounding with exhilaration. She knows scandal will follow, but in this moment, the wind in her hair feels like freedom. She clutches his hand, believing love is worth the risk. For her, scandal is not prison but possibility. Yet years later, even she may look back with weary eyes, realizing that freedom was fleeting, the cost far heavier than imagined. The village never forgot, the whispers never ended, so abductions, elopements, and escapes were all threads in the tapestry of medieval marriage. Threads dyed with scandal, woven with misery, yet gleaming with rare sparks of defiance. Some were stories of violence, some of choice, some of desperate hope, but all carried the same weight: the judgment of communities, the thunder of priests, the silence of those whose voices were never heard. The moon shines still on empty roads, echoing with hoofbeats and whispers, carrying forward the memory of those who fled, those who were stolen, and those who endured. The hearth fire burns low in the peasant's hut, the smoke curling into the rafters until it stings your eyes. A woman sits beside it, her hands busy with mending, though her stitches wander as if her mind has drifted elsewhere. Her husband snores heavily on the bench, the sour smell of ale rising from his breath. She says nothing, only sighs softly, her expression carved with quiet endurance. This is the face of so many medieval marriages, not scandalous in the moment, not violent, not dramatic, but years upon years of dutiful despair. The long silence of misery stretched across lifetimes, unremarkable yet crushing. In noble halls, misery wore finer clothes but looked the same. A lady sits at her embroidery frame, gold thread glinting beneath her needle. Her lord rides often, returning only for feasts or to demand heirs. She has jewels, servants, and fine tapestries, but she has no laughter. When minstrels sing of love, she listens politely, never letting her eyes betray the ache within her. Her misery is not dramatic enough for chronicles, but it gnaws at her like moths in silk. The silence in these marriages was louder than quarrels. Quarrels, at least, broke the monotony with fire. Silence stretched across days, years, generations. Husbands worked fields or fought wars, wives spun wool or managed households. Words dwindled to commands and replies, affection withered under routine. Even when both partners were kind, their kindness often carried no spark. Marriage was not a meeting of souls but a contract of survival. And so, silence filled the spaces where laughter might have been. Children noticed. They grew up watching their parents move like strangers in the same hut or hall. A boy saw his father rarely speak to his mother, except to order her. A girl saw her mother's face pale with resignation each time. Another child was born. These children learned that marriage was endurance, not joy, and they carried those lessons into their own lives. Thus the silence repeated itself, handed down like an heirloom no one wanted yet no one dared discard. Priests praised patience, urging wives to submit and husbands to persevere. Sermons painted obedience as holy, suffering as sanctified. Endure, they preached, for Christ endured. Yet endurance without affection left many feeling hollow. People obeyed, yes, but their sighs at the hearth spoke louder than any sermon. The church may have seen virtue in silence, but for those who lived it, silence was not holy, it was suffocating. In villages, neighbors sometimes whispered about such unions. He is not cruel, but he is cold, one might say. Or, she works hard, but she never smiles. These were not scandals worth punishment. but they were tragedies nonetheless. Misery without noise rarely made it to court records, but it shaped lives more profoundly than any public shame. Quiet marriages were graves for laughter, and yet they passed unnoticed, unremarked. Among nobles, silence carried political consequences. A marriage without affection might still produce heirs, but it bred instability. A lady ignored by her lord might turn to a lover, sparking rumours that undermined succession. A lord neglected by his wife's silence might seek warmth elsewhere, bringing mistresses into the hall and fueling gossip. The absence of love left a vacuum that scandal eagerly filled, thus even misery in silence had political weight. Some people found ways to cope. Women poured their hearts into prayer, finding in devotion the tenderness absent at home. Men drowned their silence in ale, in hunts, in wars. Some sought escape in small pleasures. A song sung while spinning, a tale told by the fire, a jest whispered among friends. These were crumbs of comfort scattered across years of monotony. Yet for many, even such crumbs were rare. Silence became not just a circumstance but an identity. The humour of the time reflected this bleakness. Rustic jokes often poked fun at husbands and wives who endured each other without joy. Better to marry a stone, one rhyme went, for at least it does not snore. People laughed, but the laughter hid recognition. Everyone knew couples like that, couples whose lives were long sighs rather than bright songs. The humour was a balm, but a thin one. In noble courts, poets celebrated courtly love, precisely because it contrasted so sharply with real marriages. Knights pined for unattainable ladies, ladies wept for absent knights, and troubadours made it all sound beautiful. But this poetry only highlighted the truth. Marriage itself was rarely about passion. Listeners smiled wistfully at such verses, their own silent misery deepened by comparison. The dream of romance was sung loudly because the reality was so quiet. Picture a woman in a peasant hut after her 10th child has died in infancy. She sits staring into the ashes, her husband too weary to speak. They do not quarrel, they do not comfort, they endure. Their marriage is not cruel, yet it is heavy. Each day another stone on their backs. Their neighbours speak of them as steady, reliable, godly. But if you leaned close enough, you would hear the silence ringing in their hearts. Picture a nobleman dining at his long table, his wife seated across from him. They speak of accounts, of tenants, of alliances. Their words are polite, their manners correct, but when the meal ends they part without glance or touch. They are bound together in name, yet live parallel lives that never meet. Their servants speak of their dignity, their chronicler notes their alliance, but behind closed doors lies silence as vast as any battlefield. The church sometimes celebrated widows and widowers who chose never to remarry, seeing in their solitude a kind of holiness. Yet many of those people had simply had enough. After enduring one marriage of silence, they preferred solitude to another. Better the loneliness of singlehood than the loneliness of lying beside someone who never spoke with warmth. Their choice was framed as piety, but perhaps it was exhaustion. Even when love existed at first, silence often swallowed it. A young couple might begin with laughter, but years of toil, hunger, and duty wore it away. By middle age, they spoke little, their love reduced habit. They may not even realize it has faded until they look back, remembering how they once laughed together at the well or sang at festivals. Now they sit in silence, unable to recall when joy disappeared. Misery crept in, not with thunder but with footsteps too soft to hear. Scandalous marriages are easy to remember, the abductions, the adulteries, the cousin scandals, but the silent ones were more common, more enduring. They were not recorded in court rolls or chronicles, yet they shaped the medieval world profoundly. They created generations of children raised in households without tenderness, communities defined by endurance rather than joy. Silence itself was scandal, though unspoken. It was the great shadow behind all vows. So when you think of medieval marriage, do not think only of noise, of feasts, contracts, punishments. Think also of silence, the silence of the hearth, the silence of beds where partners lay apart, the silence of sighs, swallowed rather than spoken. This silence was misery in its purest form, stretching across lifetimes, unremarked yet unrelenting. It is a silence you can almost hear now, if you lean close to the fire, a silence that outlived the vows themselves. The years have worn the edges of the village church smooth, its stones weathered by wind and rain, its bell cracked but still tolling faintly each morning. Inside, the air smells of wax and dust, of prayers long whispered and long forgotten. In the back pews sit the old couples, their backs bent, their hands gnarled. They have endured decades of marriage, through gossip, contracts, dowries, cousins, pregnancies and quarrels. Yet when you look at them closely, you see not love etched in their faces, but something else. The quiet endurance of scandal's memory, outliving the vows themselves. Whispers clung to them from youth, and those whispers did not fade with age. The widow, whose first marriage had been annulled for consanguinity, still carried the label of incestuous, though she had long since remarried and raised children. The man once fined for adultery decades earlier still bore the nickname cuckold among the villagers, muttered in jest, though his hair was white and his steps slow. Scandal outlived the passion that sparked it. It lingered like smoke in rafters, staining lives long after the fire burned out. Picture an old woman stirring a pot in her cottage. She mutters softly to herself, her hands steady despite their tremor. She remembers her forced marriage to a cousin, her years of silence, her children who left long ago. Neighbors pass her door and still whisper, "That is the woman who wed too close to kin." The scandal of her youth became the definition of her entire life. It mattered little that she endured faithfully, worked diligently, or prayed fervently. The whisper drowned it all. In noble courts, the echoes were just as cruel. A queen accused of adultery in her youth might live 40 more years, her innocence long proven, but her name forever shadowed by the charge. Chroniclers preserved rumors alongside facts, and history carried the stain forward. Generations later, readers remembered the scandal, but not the truth. For nobles, the whispers etched themselves into books. For peasants, they etched into memory. Both endured the same fate, scandal outliving vows, outliving love, outliving life itself. And yet, amid the bitterness, there was also resilience. Some couples learned to laugh at the whispers, to shrug at the old rumors. An old man might joke, yes, she was stolen away, but she came back for the bread, softening the memory with humor. An old woman might mutter, if being miserable were a sin, half this village would be in hell already. These wry smiles were their quiet rebellion, a way of reclaiming dignity from the gossip that had long claimed them. Still, the silence of misery lingered. Old couples often sat together without speaking, their bond one of endurance rather than affection. They had lived through famine, plague, childbirth, and toil, but not through tenderness. Their children were gone, their neighbors younger, their lives reduced to shared routine. In their silence, you hear the weight of vows kept not out of love, but out of fear, obligation, or lack of alternatives. Even in their twilight, they bore the shape of contracts written long ago. Scandal shaped not only reputations but entire communities. Villagers remembered who eloped, who was abducted, who bore children suspiciously soon after weddings. These stories became part of local folklore, told at hearths as warnings to younger generations. Do not wed your cousin, or you will end like her. Do not stray from your vows, or you will wear horns forever. The old lived not only their own lives, but as cautionary tales for others. Their misery became moral lesson. The church added its voice, preserving memories of scandal through sermons and confessionals. Old sins were recalled long after repentance. A woman might kneel in confession in her 70s and still whisper of a lover from her 20s, her guilt unshriven despite decades of piety. The priest might absolve her, but the memory lingered. Scandal had a way of binding itself to souls, as if vows and whispers alike were written not on parchment but on skin. Some old couples bore tender memories. Yes, rare unions where affection grew over years despite rough beginnings, but even these were haunted by the culture around them. Their neighbors still judged, still whispered, still remembered past scandals. Love might blossom privately, but scandal always hovered publicly. It was a shadow no affection could entirely erase. Humor remained brittle but persistent. Old men joked about their wives' tempers. Old women teased about their husbands' snores. The laughter was soft, sometimes genuine, sometimes defensive. Behind the jokes lay decades of resignation. We survived, their smiles seemed to say, even if we did not thrive. Survival itself was a kind of victory in a world where marriage was built less on joy than on endurance. Imagine the final years of such couples. The husband lies ill in bed, the wife tending him silently. Neighbors murmur that he was unfaithful in his youth, though decades have passed. She feeds him broth, remembers the silence of their life together, wonders if she ever loved him at all. He coughs, stares at the rafters, and perhaps remembers another woman's face, another life never lived. The priest comes, prays, and records their union as faithful. But beneath the record lies the truth. Scandal and silence shared their bed as surely as they did. Children, now grown, inherit not only land but whispers. They are judged by their parents' scandals. Her mother eloped, remember. His father was accused of consanguinity. The cycle repeats, whispers stretching across generations. The misery of parents becomes the inheritance of children, proving again that scandal outlived vows, outlived even those who first bore them. And yet, in a strange way, scandal gave people a sense of belonging. To be spoken of was to be remembered. Even misery became identity. An old woman walking to church may carry her shame like a cloak, but at least she is not invisible. In villages where anonymity was death, scandal at least ensured one's name lingered, better whispered about than forgotten entirely. The silence of misery remained the heaviest truth, though. Couples who endured decades together without tenderness found themselves bound more tightly in death than in life. Buried side by side in the churchyard, their names carved together in stone, they were remembered as faithful spouses by those who never knew the silence between them. The inscription lied, but stone endures. Silence was buried beneath sanctity, misery beneath memory. And so, when you look back on medieval marriages, remember that their true story lies not only in feasts and contracts, not only in scandals shouted in courts or whispered at wells. It lies in the long echo of misery, in whispers that lasted longer than vows, in silences that shaped entire generations. Scandal did not end when candles guttered or when priests pronounced absolution. It lived on, in memory, in gossip, in chronicles, in sighs whispered into the dark. It outlasted love, outlasted vows, outlasted life itself. Now as the final candle burns low, you feel the story itself slow. The voices fade into whispers, the bells toll softer, the rafters settle into silence. The long tale of medieval marriages has wound its course, its scandals told, its misery is endured. Let the imagery soften now. Let your breath slow. Let the noise fall away. You are no longer in smoky halls or cold huts, no longer among gossiping villagers or calculating nobles. You are here, in the quiet, listening to echoes fade. Let the last whispers drift into stillness. Let the scandals rest at last. And let your shoulders relax, your eyes grow heavy, your mind loosen its grip. The story has ended, but its echo lingers, softer, gentler, fading like a candle's final glow.